This video is now in session, and Texas is in the middle of trying to implement a voting law that will be one of the most restrictive voting laws in the nation. So, currently speaking, Texas has already passed this in the Senate, but they were not able to pass it in the House. And the reason why they were not able to pass it in the House was because Democrats staged a walkout. They walked out of the Texas State Legislature, and as a result, there was not enough votes present in order to actually vote on the voting rights bill. And that's how we got to this conundrum today. How we have this chaos that's happening with Greg Abbott trying to threaten repercussions because of this walkout. He's saying that he wants to dock their pay. He wants to remove all of their pays for the next session. And that may seem like a repercussion, but the Democrats have already done it. They've already walked out, and generally speaking, you don't really make that much money in the first place being a Texas state legislature, maybe around $72,000. So as a result, it's actually 72,000 may be a lot for some people. I retract that statement. Anyway, the Texas voting bill is still most likely going to be passed sometime in the future, but let's get into what it is and what's in it. So the Texas voting bill is meant to supposedly ensure election integrity in our elections. So, in terms of mail-in, it focuses on practically everything from when you cast your early vote, or I mean when you register to vote, all the way to the tabulations of the vote. And you can see, I think if I click this link right here, you can see the actual bill in its entirety. I will put this link in the description below, but you can see it is a very, very long bill. I can scroll all the way down here and it's still going. But anyway, let's start with early voting. Early voting is now going to be restrictive to just a set period. It's no longer up to the counties as to when early voting can happen. And this is mainly meant to target Harris County. Harris County in the 2020 election introduced 24-hour early voting. And what 24-hour early voting means is that it's literally just all day voting. But the main purpose of 24-hour voting was that there are a lot of people who work from dusk to dawn, who work multiple jobs to keep their wage at an acceptable level, and from there being able to care either for themselves or for their family. And as a result, it's hard to vote in within the regular time periods that a person can vote, between like 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. It's very hard for people to do that. So this 24-hour voting strategy allows people to be able to vote after going to work, which means that if your shift ends at, let's say, 12 a.m., you can go to the voting place because it's still open, and then you can from there you can go back to your house. And that's practically what 24-hour early voting does. It makes voting easier for the disenfranchised, for those who are lower income, and those who might not have as much resources to vote in the regular times. But this bill restricts that. So now, instead of 24-hour voting, what's allowed is only 12-hour voting. So or not 12, at least 12-hour voting. So 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. is the maximum time you can do for early voting. You cannot go above those bounds, except for a few large counties where it's open until 10 p.m. And that's the restriction in the early voting department. And you can see there that with the 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. Voting times, it's not going to cover everyone, especially those in big cities who might not work as much, who might not work as much, who might not have as much time to vote, because there are definitely people who work really long hours in cities because they're trying to maintain a living wage, and thus they're disenfranchised of their ability to vote because there is no election holiday, and voting in election is not easy. They could try to vote by mail, but they can't now because this bill also restricts who can vote by mail. Primarily, it's seniors who can vote by mail, and that's practically the major group. But there are other initiatives that were done by Harris County in order to increase voter turnout that, generally speaking, have been banned at this point. Another example is drive-through voting. Harris County implemented drive-through voting in the 2020 election at the NRG Center, I believe, in order to increase the amount of votes, or in order to have more people turn out to vote and to make voting much more convenient. That will be banned, so now you can no longer vote if you're in your car. Another thing that's being done is that it's that mail-in ballots. Mail drop boxes will be limited in terms of mail-in ballots. In terms of mail-in ballots, state, counties, and local officials can no longer send mail-in ballots to those who haven't requested them. That's something that Harris County tried to do in the 2020 election, where they sent mail-in applications to all 2.4 million registered voters, which isn't a mail-in ballot. It's not automatically sending a mail-in ballot. What it's doing is it's automatically sending an application to vote by mail, and those are two different things. But that will be banned in the future. So Harris County did it, and a lot of other Texas counties did it for the elderly, for those 65 years and older. That will not be allowed in future elections. And then you can't use public funds to also help with the distribution of ballot applications by third parties, and that means that the state legislature wants to assume that responsibility. That said, in terms of funding, they're not planning to give that much funds to compensate for this fact right here. But there is one thing that this bill does, which is somewhat positive, which is it does call for identification requirements. So yeah, voter ID requirements. And generally speaking, I don't get why Democrats are going against voter ID requirements. Affidavits may be a little too far, but for your voter ID, if you present a driver's license, if you present any kind of identification card, which you normally would have in the first place, then that would just make you make sure that no one else is trying to impersonate you. So it doesn't make sense as to why you should be going against voter ID laws unless if you're going against affidavits. But for Democrats, some of them are going against voter ID laws, but there's still a lot that is not good about this bill that is against the idea of expanding who can vote and making it easier for everyone to vote fairly and securely, because America has always progressed more and more to the stage of voting. It's not right to say that America has prided itself on voting, because it's always been a journey to that stage where America can pride itself. Originally, America's could only allow, or America would only allow white men who own land to vote. They would not allow anyone else to vote, and then it expanded to white men, and then expanded to men, and then expanded to men and women, and now it's about making elections, trying to not disenfranchise voters now. So that's through mail-in ballots. That's through ADA, being ADA compliant. That's through more languages for election ballots. So these initiatives are what make elections easier to vote in, yet make it still safe. in terms of statistics and in terms of just being objective here, there really hasn't been any notable signs of fraud in the 2020 election, and that's something that is very well disputed by a lot of Republicans, but that's simply the truth. There is not really any conclusive evidence to see that there was actually a stolen election. It's all just rhetoric, and it's all just politicians trying to brainwash you into thinking that the election was stolen, also that they can fulfill the ego of Donald Trump, and that's the truth. Now, the Texas voting law, it's going to help Republicans in the short term in terms of like the 2022, 2024, 2026, 2028, even the 2030 election. But in the future, it's not going to necessarily help them. It's mainly just a short-term solution to the problem that they face in Texas, because Texas is trending more and more for Democrats. And there will be, it's at this point inevitable for Democrats to regain Texas. Since 1976, they have not won a presidential election in this state, but they're bound to win Texas in a future presidential election, and that's not just a liberal wish dream, and it's not a liberal wish list, not part of a liberal wish list, because just take a look at how Texas is getting an increased population. Texas is gaining 2 House of Representative seats this year, and the reason why is because of migration, domestic migration from California and from New York, the two of the most liberal states in the union. So you can see here that a lot of Democrats are moving over to Texas as well as New York, and the reason why they're moving over to Texas is because of the new industries in Texas, primarily the tech industry and the healthcare industry in Harris County. So as a result, you have a lot of Democrats moving over to lucrative jobs in Texas, and from there, making Texas more and more Democrat. Meanwhile, the same thing is not really happening with Republicans. You don't really see that many Republicans moving from the rural states over to Texas, and thus Democrats at this point are bound to take over Texas in a future election. It's only just a matter of time. So part of the reason why Republicans are passing this bill is because they want to limit the scope of the Democrats' powers in these big concentrated cities. They want to make it harder for the Democrats. That said, they're also not doing it right, because they're indirectly also hurting Republicans. They're hurting their own base by passing this bill. Because of these more restrictive voter laws, it makes it harder for those in Republican counties and for those along the Rio Grande Valley, which is an important group of voters to both Democrats and Republicans, to actually vote. There are people along the Rio Grande Valley, many people who have to vote late, who have to vote who can only vote after polls closed. And with this restrictive measure, then they're not allowed to vote. They won't be able to vote. And you can say sucks on them to not be able to vote, but it is a right at this point for everyone who's an adult and a U.S. citizen to have the eligibility to vote. And it also not only hurts the Rio Grande Valley, but it also hurts the suburbs, and it hurts the Republicans and Democrats in the suburbs, because in Tarrant County, Williamson County, and the Harris County suburbs, all of these suburbs, they will have a harder time to vote, just because you can't use mail-in ballots anymore unless if you're an elderly. You also can't vote early unless you happen to fall in the times when early voting is permitted, and you won't be able to have convenience, and you'll have to set a set time in order to vote in the first place, because you can't go through drive-through voting. You can't go through these measures implemented by Harris County that was supposed to be implemented in future elections but now can't with this voting law bill, and thus it's snowballing into one of the most restrictive voting laws in the nation. And that's why Democrats walked out in the 2020 election, not 2020. That's why they walked out of the state legislature just a couple hours before, not a couple hours, just half an hour before the session ended. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.